Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Switzerland. It's not the first time. We focus mostly, of course, on the 15th century military side of the story for obvious reasons. But, of course, Swiss history in the medieval millennium is not just, in fact, the end of, say, the Swiss pikeman meme. It is plenty of history, which is also the one naturally leading to the establishment of the Swiss Confederacy and the sort of more famous later medieval and Renaissance era, which we will not talk about today, not just because we have at least already framed that topic with some introductory videos that will be followed, of course, by others on the Swiss military, but because this video belongs to the regional series for which I plan to make a video about the Swiss Confederacy separated from the rest of Swiss history, so that we will look at the whole topics more comprehensively without sort of focusing on the sort of more political history, of course, of the Swiss Confederacy apart from the rest of medieval Switzerland, so that everything gets covered adequately. And of course, as you know, our policy in Schwerpunkt is the one to reserve ourselves the pleasure to cover topics ad libitum without any limitation. So that's what we are fundamentally doing. I had never made a video about Alemannia and Alpine Russia that in part overlaps with some things we will say today, but in fact it's not quite the same thing either, right? And I will not make too many introductions about what we intend, of course, as Switzerland, that is definitely established by approximation by the Swiss Confederacy as such. This territory is otherwise part of the broader Alemannia/Swabia that we also discussed in a separate regional historical chapter as medieval Swabia, and we'll see today how, of course, deeply the history of Switzerland is intertwined with sort of neighboring areas. We talk about Alsace as well. You can find everything in the medieval Germany, or again also from the historical regional series. As you know, they overlap. So again, this is for people who are new with my content, maybe do not know where to search for it. And so we start from the beginning, normally from late antiquity. So in this period of Christianization, you can argue that in many ways what would become Switzerland by approximation begins to ideally take shape, and or at least it starts founding a more enucleated cultural legacy on its own. We have a copious hagiography regarding martyrs like Felix and Regula in Zurich that are inspired surely by events of actual persecution of the Christians, likely under the ones of the persecution of Diocletian. Made multiple videos on Diocletian, also dealing with specifically the persecution. We're around 298 in this case. Here, like in theory, the empire was, of course, legislating against and executing those Christians that refused to comply with the diktats of the Imperial religion. So this happened, however, in a relatively heterogeneous way. Like the greater massacres were concentrated just in specific areas. Provincial governors had discretion over this. And the Swiss territory is deeply connected with this also from an identity point of view that partially connects it also with other parts of Germany. There is the episode of the Theban Legion, right? This would have been hundreds of Roman soldiers martyred near Saint-Maurice-en-Valais, which is called like this for the obvious reference to the head of this legion, that was Saint Maurice, that, as you know, is a great figure in medieval spirituality. I also made a video about the very, very beginning of Schwerpunkt on plate armor during the 13th century, as you know, on the beautiful Saint Maurice statue at Magdeburg Cathedral, just in front of the tomb of Otto I. And so there is a body of legend that develops further, but you can argue that here, the Switzerland is the very very heart of the place where the events would have occurred, and it spreads, in fact, far and wide across various towns in the country. In their as probably a matter of deep identity. The establishment of the first bishoprics on the Swiss territory, of course, goes in parallel with it, especially between the 4th and the 5th centuries. We have Basel documented as a diocese as early as 346. We have Martigny in 381. Albeit this diocese was relocated to Sion-en-Valais in 585. Geneva, 441, and Cours in Alpine, Russia, that I discussed a little bit, in fact, in the aforementioned video. In this case, the bishopric was founded in 451, hell of a year. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was happening not too far away from there. And this chronological frame is quite interesting because, as we will see now, the land was not uniformly Christianized. Actually, it was Christianized in great part of the beginning of this period. Then, with the barbarian invasions, it sort of regressed in that into what we improperly call paganism. Now, there is evidence from the 6th century indicating that Lausanne as well may have had a diocese in its own, which was probably transferred in that case from Avanches. So, you know what's happening more or less all around. The Western Roman Empire is fundamentally evaporating. Imperial authority, properly north of the Alps, start waning, and this happens in parallel with the Germanic settlements caused by the migration of these large central, northern, also Eastern European at that point confederacies into this area that had been always one of the frontier fundamentally, but it's composite, because from once, if you go like down mountain, you have, of course, the border that is formed by the Danube and the Rhine already. As you know, part of that was the Agri de Cumates, one of the few medium fertile areas of Germany that the Romans had settled. In fact, for that reason, these territories are Celto-Roman historically, right? And up mountain also, like, Romanization had never been quite intense, debatably, like at least there were many fortifications and an important, of course, Roman presence all throughout its history. But the Roman Empire was not the sort of uniforming machine that we think to begin with. And of course, these places had already developed some sort of autonomous sentiment. However, when the Germans start settling, things change because new frontiers, if anything, are shaped. There's this new ethnic element. The Burgundians are settled by the Romans from the Middle Rhine into the Jura area, the Rhone Valley, and the Southern Alps near Lake Geneva, while the Alemanni had crossed the Rhine in 406 and had gradually assimilated the local Gallo-Roman population, or pushing it back into the mountains, which is, however, something that would happen to them as well when they will be essentially crushed by the Franks, that obliges them to seek refuge up mountain, in great part as essentially frontier garrisons of the Italic kingdom of Odoacer, that was the major power around, with the Ostrogoths siding again as Arians with at least those in part even non-Christianized peoples were trying to escape, especially the Merovingian Catholic push. By the way, by 534, the same Burgundy becomes part, de facto, of the Frankish Empire. Alemannia would be incorporated a couple of years later. However, these areas would remain, especially the latter, somehow decentralized. Alemannia in particular was sort of less developed to begin with, but for this reason, Christianization regressed, and some pagan practices, such as, for example, burying warriors in arms, fortunately at least provided us with, adequately preserved funerary. We talk a bit about this funerary goods, and well until the 8th century, when probably the Carolingians crushed this now Franco-Alemannic aristocracy that had already been established by the Merovingians. The kings of Burgundy, in particular, actively promoted Christianization because they ruled an area that was much more deeply Romanized and sort of brought to the much quicker assimilation of the Romans and the Germans, which was translated also in the royal establishment of new monasteries. Remember, so here we're making a video about what would become Switzerland, which in this sense did not exist yet. So we see that part of the territory is ruled by the Burgundians and the other by the Alemanni. And some cases of Burgundian royal monastic foundations in this period are the ones at Romain-Moutier and the aforementioned Saint-Maurice en Valais, founded in 515. The Alemannic area instead witnessed less of this phenomenon. There were some isolated Christian communities enduring, because of course the country was not to simply go back or to be totally isolated. It was more like a broader political stance of the Alemanni that having essentially been beaten by the Franks remained stuck, of course, into the also anti-Catholic policy. Otherwise, had they won and taken over Gaul, they would have likely done the same, even though we shouldn't give that for granted, because really what Clovis did was extraordinary in many ways. Of course, on the longer run, this lands would have already become Catholic. And they were already, if of course, how Catholicism predates Christianity. But it was a matter also of civilizational limits to an extent in the poorer parts. That, in fact, witnessed still the presence of, Vaudanic cult at large. We know that the men were sort of more politically, again, aligned in that sense in the public arena, international arena, against the Franks and Catholicism. However, their women also quickly adopted, as soon as they settled into Roman territory, the Roman fashion and its similitudes. It's very interesting to look at that as well. So when we look at the early 7th century, when in the West, the migration era is fundamentally over, Christian monks appear. We're talking about the Gaelic mission of Columbanus and Gallus, that, as you know, were apostles of at least an important part of Germanic peoples. The bishopric of Constance is founded at this point under the Carolingians, that basically retake control of Alemannia after the decline of the Merovingian dynasty, and reinforce, of course, monastic foundations together with the vassalatic beneficiary system. Monasteries and bishoprics really are grounding the essential power base. Right? At this point, the local nobility is fully, in that sense, feudal and Christian, molding this Alpine, pre-Alpine part of the empire in its own image. With the Treaty of Verdun in 843, what is today's Switzerland, territorially speaking, went to Lotharingia, ruled by Lothar I, plus the east was part of the Duchy of Alemannia within the Eastern Frankish Kingdom governed by Louis the German. I made a video about him some months ago. So you have a very interesting situation because of the obvious overlapping of so many different spheres of influence. All of these territories, however, would fit in what would later be known in a more confined and definitive sense, a political territorial sense, the Holy Roman Empire. Right, so there are different kingdoms within it, especially in this case the one of Germany and one of Ireland. But this lands in many ways act as a bridge also between the two, maintaining some distinctiveness, which is not particularly evident, like until the later Middle Ages, the end of the High One. In any case, you see the boundary between Alemannia under Louis the German and Western Burgundy under Lothar, following the valley of the Lower Aare, thus turning south at the Rhine, passing west of Lucerne, and crossing the Alps along the Upper Rhone to the St. Gotthard Pass. That was also like the main deal eventually why Switzerland would sort of evolve, among the other things. It's a frontier area. You have Italy, Gaul, Swabia, Burgundy. This is such a crucial place. We've already seen it in the video about Alsace, right? Think about Strasbourg actually deriving its name exactly from the fact that so many different roads, like one from France, Germany, Italy, crossed, right? And they had this Roman past, but it was a Germanic city by then. So there's a lot of potential because definitely Switzerland was not a particularly rich country at all, right? This is one of the great paradoxes in European history, that among the most successful peoples, not just in Europe but in the world, you have the Swiss and the Dutch that initially occupied lands that literally had nothing. And I mean zero. Like the Swiss especially did not have anything whatsoever. They didn't have metals, they didn't have any particularly precious resource, whatever. They had, however, this strategic location that, especially in relation to the Alpine passes, would stimulate that long path of autonomization, one with, we'll see now, with great effort, blood, and tears that would eventually reward them on the longer run. I explained all these things, by the way, in the aforementioned videos about Swiss warfare, so we're not going to digress too much on this now. But the St. Gotthard, at least as the pass, the geographic feature, here we're talking, this pass is above 2,100 meters from the sea level, right? It's significant, to say the least, mountain pass in the Alps, linking, especially in this Swiss perspective, the northern and the southern part of the country. Like it lies between Airolo in the Italian-speaking canton of Ticino and Andermatt in the German-speaking canton of Uri, right, further connecting Bellinzona and Lugano to Lucerne, Basel, and Zurich. So a hell of a location that, of course, already at this point, like especially in Carolingian times, with the reactivation of transalpine traffic, especially between northern France and northern Italy, right, it is really, really important. But still, of course, the local development is limited, so it's not like this area has played this crucial role, unless you look at, for example, the entire Duchy of Alemannia, that, especially in the later Carolingian period and the post-Carolingian one as well, will starkly autonomize, right? Now, in 853, Louis the German granted his lands in the Reuss Valley to the monastery of St. Felix and Regula in Zurich. We have seen that spiritual legacy remaining, being here connected probably with royal donations. This monastery is today the Frau Münster. It's known with this Danish list. And this, of course, was a female monastery. In fact, the same, we already discussed it in that video about Louis the German, the same king's daughter, Hildegard, served as the first abbess. This is a completely typical patrimonial and royal policy as a strategy of the time. Essentially, you endow these lands properly with particular immunities, liberties, and you put your offspring at the head of the ecclesiastical community. Nobody can inherit it, but as long as you are the king, you can appoint whoever you want on it. And of course, Zurich was that important for having like an important estates connected to such, in fact, royal monastery. For the Eastern Frankish king, that, let's stress this, ruled mostly from Regensburg and was very much focused also in southeastern Germany, but the attempt that would repeat itself for a very long time in German history to have like an entire control of the Alpine passes for obvious reasons, especially since the Roman crowning had already been reactivated, and of course the traffics between Central and Southern Europe were quite intense, would bring kings to carry out these policies. In structure, right, sediment these local powers, in fact, regardless of eventually the success of the original founders' dynasties, right? There is a legend regarding Louis' grant to Hildegard that is inspired by an apparition of a stag bearing an illuminated crucifix. You know, of course, that the stag's antlers, where in fact the cross appears, is a symbol of the crucifixion of the cross itself. And this vision would have appeared to the king in the marshes near the town along the shores of Lake Zurich. However, historical evidence suggests, of course, that the monastery even predated by the time of the foundation we've seen in 853, which, of course, makes some sense. I mean, it's not necessarily typical that it would be a refoundation somewhere really ex novo, but it also stresses the importance of the place. The Fraumünster is located across the river from the Großmünster, which by legend was established by Charlemagne himself. I made a video recently about royal abbeys and explaining why the Carolingians went very far in establishing all these massive royal abbeys and providing them with an enormous amount of immunities, because it was really the attempt to create some sort of inalienable backbone that public authority could sort of manage, right? This is, of course, the attempt of emperors also in the West to control the church directly. And the legend in Charlemagne's case is that his horse fell to its knees at the burial site of, obviously, the martyrs Felix and Regula, that are the main reason why, of course, you would expect to have been there a pretty important monastery in Zurich already, which also, from, of course, the geographical version, stresses, of course, the sort of the mutual recognition of power between God and the emperor. Now, when these estates were granted to the monastery, the latter was exempt from the authority of all feudal lords, except, of course, the king, and later the emperor, right? So this, because this was of Louis the German and Frau Münster, and this arrangement is known. We've seen it also for other communities of the empire, such as the Freie Reichsstädte, the one of imperial immediacy, right? The Reichsfreiheit or Reichsunmittelbarkeit, which basically means that nobody can dispose of this patrimony in any way, that there is no sub-infeudation of these places, just historically, even when, of course, these are part territorially of a broader district like Swabia could be, there is no such thing like a local lay control of the same. Only the sacred ruler can interact in this higher sphere and maintain, in fact, a strong bond with the community. And then this was, again, we have seen it conferred upon the abbey as a privileged status, including reduced taxes and greater autonomy, really shared by many other royal and imperial abbeys that at some point were occupied, were confiscated. There was a lot of debate regarding this as well. However, this donation has, of course, a pivotal role in encouraging other landholders in the same Valais to place themselves under the monastery's jurisdiction, which would, in that sense, in turn, place themselves into imperial immediacy, or at least, the monastery would have, in a way, protected them. And somebody had attacked them, at least the monastery could call the emperor and say, look, here pretty bad things are happening. This is an ecclesiastical signory, of course, that in part provides the local subjects with the same benefits of the imperial immunity, right? And of course, however, the imperial authority was delegated at some point to a specific figure in the region that was the advocatus in Latin, or vogt in German, a position entrusted to various, mostly local families that, of course, the emperor trusted enough not to infringe upon the liberties of this ecclesiastical signory. Again, the ups and downs of the empire make everything more difficult, but these privileges are really foundational and sort of they echo, of course, across the centuries. Including the 10th one, the so-called Iron Century, when the unity of the empire diminishes, the influence of the Carolingian dynasty as well, as or whoever had managed to rule from there on, even with an imperial title, began to wane. And you have actually all sorts of mordiers that attack the same Swiss territory. For example, the Magyars that ravaged Basel in 917, St. Gallen in 926. Consider that St. Gallen is one, together with the Abbey of Reichenau and other ecclesiastical centers in the Teutonic Kingdom, the ones that really start creating, through their historiography, properly the sense that there is a national identity in the latter, right? The idea of what we think about Germany in a national sense is being molded exactly from these very centers, right? That, as we've seen, are provided with this enormous spiritual legacy. St. Gallen, of course, with Gallus, the evangelization of the same country. There is all a deep prestige and pride of evangelization that are located in Switzerland, which makes it also more painful when the Saracens pillaged Valais after 920, after having attacked the same monastery of Saint Maurice in 939. This is a bit like, when the Saracens devastate the basilicas of St. Peter, St. Paul in Rome, right? That they were targeting in many ways, Santiago in Spain. That they were targeting exactly the symbols of Catholicism, that, however, all remained unwavering banners of of the deepest imperial Christendom. In fact, like, this is interesting because the Saracens, for example, attacked from bases like the ones of Fraxinetum in Provence, passing through the Alpine valleys, ravaging Piedmont, but also entering the Rhine Valley, right? So basically all three, the main post-Carolingian kingdoms, or all four, like if we were to count them, plus other lands, because they're not the only ones, are ravaged by all three, Magyars, Saracens, and Vikings. And in fact, wherever Vikings in Switzerland, at least not historically recorded. However, during this period, you witness, of course, also a political fragmentation typical of the post-Carolingian period. It is the same cause of these incursions, telling the truth. It's not like the local communities were powerless. But, of course, they are pursuing very shrewd policies. For example, the 10th century is the moment in which the Conradines of Wetterau established a long-lasting rule over Swabia. Right? It's not until the Ottonian Renovatio Imperii, and especially the victory over the Magyars on the Lech in 955, so in southern Germany, the Swiss territories are practically reintegrated into a functional, more or less functional, Eastern Frankish kingdom that is also now the main see of also the Holy Roman Emperor. In 999, King Rudolph III the Pious of the Kingdom of Aralat, he reigned between 993 and 1032, granted the Valais as a fief to the Bishop of Sion, that is also in Valais. And when Burgundy, along with Valais, became part of the Holy Roman Empire in 1032, when basically the Germans managed to annexate, at least in a virtually institutional sense, this kingdom to the Holy Roman Empire for good, the Bishop of Sion was subsequently appointed Count of Valais. We are, of course, in the period of the bishops' counts, and this is especially important in such a frontier region like this one, because the German kings would just episodically go to Burgundy, right? It was already a lot if they could descend into Italy, and mostly were absorbed by the pretty tumultuous matters of the same Germany. So they decide in both these kingdoms to establish some, like a bit like we've seen with the monasteries, like to attribute some, in this case, something different, like the attribution of a public authority, of a secular one, to the local bishops that from the age of the Second Invasions have also developed, because of the aforementioned ravages, have assumed the control of the local communities, because they come from the same lay families, but at least as bishops they cannot simply inherit the diocese. There is a lot of nepotism and sort of corruption in the whole system, but at least the idea that whoever rules from the diocese, which can in any case be appointed by the same king whenever he comes there, will reinforce this local seigneury and allow, through this cooptation and preferential appointees, when possible, a greater control on the area. Again, this part of southwestern Germany and Burgundy was hardly ever reached by the various Eastern Frankish kings and emperors. It was also pretty close to the Western Frankish kingdom, so crucial we've seen already in those times, but in the way like the various centers of power had been developing, like distant from the main court, and so being sort of a blurred area, right? The Saxons ruled from Saxony. the Western Franks from the France already. There wasn't really, like, even the Burgundian kings were often like incapable of controlling more than half of the entire kingdom of Ireland. That was also normally the southern part. The Italics do not intervene, at least in a national sense, in these areas. Dynastically, yes, but this is a way to thicken the local feudal government, which many in fact of the local noblemen are very happy of, except they will struggle even more ferociously, of course, to maintain that. But that has actually a stabilizing effect on the longer run. This is also the age during which the future Swiss territory will essentially be ever more framed within a German world, right? Burgundy is a failed country of some sort. It basically evaporates. It's eventually absorbed by France at the end of the 14th century. The German parts are sort of more organized on the longer run. They have some more stratified history. For example, the areas of Bern and Aargau came under the very powerful Zähringer family, and the Habsburg rule as well, as early as the 12th century. The Count of Savoy separated from Ireland just before its dissolution in 361, basically 17 years before that happened. So this system compacts under the seigneury of actually pretty powerful noblemen, if anything, at least at a provincial level, right? The Zähringen and the Habsburgs are a Swabian power. The Savoy is in fact like a Sapaudian Burgundian one. Again, these families at some point marrying to each other, but largely they are competitive. They're warring, right? And so much, of course, of the history of these cities and cantons and other historical areas of Switzerland is connected with a prior feudal control, from which gradually, again, these communities will slip away from joining forces and exploiting especially the crisis of the 14th century. The Dukes of Zähringen were, as we just said, a Swabian noble dynasty, taking the name after the homonymous castle near Freiburg in Breisgau, that at some point will enter the same Swiss Confederacy, by the way. And these noblemen are really very consistent in the 12th and the 13th century. Speaking of power control, they found several cities, including the same Freiburg, in fact, in 1120, Fribourg, because you have this name repetition due to the meaning. Of course, these are free towns in 1157, and Bern in 1191. The sense, of course, is to counter other noblemen. So paradoxically, these towns that will at some point rise against the feudal nobility had been founded exactly by the nobility to counter other noblemen. That's what they end up doing at the end of the day. Always bearing in mind that, however, also a great part of Swiss history, politically speaking, starts through, of course, the presence of local knights and nobiliar houses that back the Confederacy, right? So it's not like there was a class struggle to an extent. There is still an oligarchy. There is still like a feudal connection, but overall the objective is to autonomize in many ways. This is typical of different leagues throughout the Holy Roman Empire, and especially moments in which the centers of power of the royal houses were really shifting, especially ever more distant from southwestern Germany, which was not the case evidently during the Hohenstaufen, when Swabia was literally the center of Imperial, worked as royal power also sometimes, because the different Hohenstaufen rule in different places, and they have, say, children that are associated to the throne or co-kings, etc., especially in Germany. Without mentioning, and I actually made an entire video about this, the fact that the Swabian nobility is not at all so compliant towards like a iron-fisted imperial rule, even when literally the emperor is from Swabia, right? On the contrary, there is this expression, the honor of Swabia, that was held by all the various Swabian noblemen, and brought to an incredible resistance to any imperial policy aimed at fundamentally damaging the Swabian territory as a duchy. For example, at one point, Frederick Barbarossa, for his Italian expedition, entrusts some Swabian territory to the Bishop of Como, and the Swabian nobility puts up a relentless resistance that endly, after many years admittedly, witnesses the return of these territories to the properly, not just to Swabia, also to the German kingdom. So not even the Hohenstaufen actually control all this, because historically we're this free nobility that the royal imperial authority recognized as such. The Zarenga dynasty ends with the death of Berchtold V in 1218, after which their cities achieved independence, because the same emperor wanted to replicate what the Zarenga policy really was by essentially turning these towns into like Freie Reichsstadt, and so not having any noblemen around to put their hands on it, because otherwise it would have created like a yet again very powerful noble seigneury to counter. This is important in the gradual affirmation of the Swiss autonomies, because, as you understand, great part of this towns will end up being the protagonists of the Helvetic Confederacy, and also because of all the liberties that, and so the wealth that had accumulated thanks to this imperial charters. Concurrently, you have the Dukes of Kyburg competing with the House of Habsburg for the control over the rural areas that had previously belonged to the Zarenga territory. This dynamic is quite crucial because, as you know, the Hohenstaufen are powerful, but in this moment Germany has been shattered by the struggle between Otto of Brunswick and the young Frederick II that rules from southern Italy, and that regardless, of course, of his relative's presence in Germany, brings to a lot of privatization of the system. It's not even 20 years from now that the edictum in favorem principum will start. So you have at the extinction of these powerful houses, of course, others that try as much as they can to seize everything in a pretty anarchic way, like including public rights, especially after the collapse of the Hohenstaufen. But this is already the case for Switzerland, where the same Hohenstaufen tried to sort of subcontract many prerogatives in exchange of money for their wars in Italy. And definitely Kyburg and Habsburg houses are the main rivals on the sea. The latter in particular get, however, the Hohenstaufen's favor. They are a very old and noble house. They descend essentially from the Romano-Burgundian nobility. However, they do not have many estates, right? They were called, like, known as the Counts of Habsburg, right? Like the Rudolph of Habsburg, like the little count when he's elected kings of the Romans at the end of the Interregnum, right? Nevertheless, this reminds, like, the history of the same Hohenstaufen, that were not so powerful among the Swabian nobility, but they had stuck with Henry IV during the investiture controversy, so that he makes them dukes of Swabia. They marry, into the same royal line, and so they eventually ascend, and not without other complications, to the royal and the imperial authority. The Habsburgs do a bit the same, like the Hohenstaufen favored them over other dynasties, which allows them to consolidate much of the territory south of the Rhine under their control. In the following generations, they successfully expanded their influence throughout Swabia and in southeastern Germany and into Austria, the obvious consequence of the triumphs scored, especially in the east, against Bohemia. First, you have the election to kings of the Romans, then the Battle of Markfeld that destroys the Permislids and basically strips them of control of Austria, Styria, Carinthia, etc. So that the Habsburgs shift their see from Swabia to Vienna, always trying to maintain this western territories that will last, in fact, at very late in time, historically, but that will be increasingly endangered by the expansion of the Swiss confederates, which they themselves, together with the Hohenstaufen, had initially contributed to nurture, right, as individual communities. And this dates easily to the Hohenstaufen dynasty's times, because of the imperial house need to reiterate their Roman expeditions into Italy, and therefore having a tight control of the Alpine passes in Russia, particularly the aforementioned St. Gotthard, that held such great strategic significance. This had become a vital direct route through the mountains. There is a specific infrastructure, the Teufelsbrücke, that is to say the Devil's Bridge, being constructed across the so-called Schöllenenschlucht in 1198. This was essentially the most important pass after the Brenner one that was used as part of the Via Regia to connect, in fact, Germany with Italy. It was the preferential route. Also, the Hohenstaufen mostly used that, but this other one was crucial because, in fact, allowed some greater interplay and sort of allowed also to diversify different routes to dilute the same power as long of these various to whoever controlled them, as long as at least as you could control them yourself, right? So what actually happens with the construction of the Devil's Bridge, that of course refers to the quite impervious location, starts fueling a great wealth injection into Switzerland. And initially, again, the feudal lords are in charge. However, the local towns become ever more important. Like there is, as we'll see now, a very interestingly hybrid nature of the Swiss exploit. Also, at the beginning of the 14th century, when you look at the various European peoples that sort of managed to counter the feudal authority with their infantries alone, because as we've said, Switzerland up to this point is a fairly primitive place in many areas, at least, especially the hinterland versus the more mountainous areas. from which much manpower, in fact, would come later, even though, of course, the more important cities in Switzerland are also the ones that control the system. Like, they have more money, they have more elite, they really address, like, they really direction the channeling of all these forces. But they fundamentally get also this amount of wealth on their own. They start evolving a little bit. They're not like, I don't know, Scottish infantrymen that are that primitive in many ways. The Swiss barely, some places, of course, they are very, very, very brutal in that regard. Some of these communities are the highest in altitude in the entire Europe. We've seen, like, there are the Valais, for example, that does stimulate a great deal of, combativeness, because if you have to fight against nature the way they had, like, of course, fighting against humans would seem much less scary, and that's part of the moral drive that will bring the Swiss to de facto independence. So this traffic along the mule track traversing the pass, the St. Gotthard, marked an increased economic growth. To exert direct control over this crucial route, Frederick II granted the status of Reichsfreiheit to Schwyz in 1240. Right? Ominous name. This was done through the Freibrief of Faenza in Romagna, where Frederick was at that point. You see, this is late in his reign, and so this corresponds already, this is 3 years after the Edictum in Favorem Principum, so the rebellion of his son Henry that eventually died suicide, as you know, on another pass, this time in Calabria. And so this is the moment in which the emperor is granting all these autonomies, if anything, to receive more support temporarily, and knowing that much of those could not simply be recovered, because now that was the situation in Germany. Everything was starting to gradually melt away, and the same public authority required liquids, right? And so they would literally sell part of public rights to do so. Frederick's son Henry, before rebelling, had served naturally as co-regent in Germany for a while, and he had already conferred the same privileges of imperial liberty upon the Valley of Uri, right, in 1231. So we have Uri, we have Schwyz, now Unterwalden will come soon, as we will see, and there you have the nucleus of what would become the Swiss Confederacy. The Freibrief of Uri had been granted at Agenau. Now, Unterwalden was effectively considered Reichsfrei already. Why, though? Because most of its territory belonged to monasteries that, as we've seen, so in the case of Zurich, had attained independence under imperial protection. This had occurred in 1173 under Frederick I Barbarossa, and it had been reconfirmed under his grandson Frederick II in 1213, 1 year, the year before Bouvines, so even before he would know where he would actually win the match in Europe or not. The city of Zurich itself also achieved Reichsfrei status in 1218, and so you have already this various set of circumstances, so different like cantons that have received privileges for, say, boosting specific, let's say, hopeful imperial control on in fact, what seemed like meek peasant communities, because again, who are the Swiss? Like, they still do not exist technically. There are so many other peasants out there, and some of them are more rowdy actually. And the political events that will trigger the rise of the Helvetic Confederacy are not quite there yet. You have like Zurich, that is just like yet another free city of the empire, and you have even Unterwalden, that basically is free just because by approximation there are it's just occupied by so many monasteries, like the local ecclesiastical lordships that are already immune, so there are some sort of ecclesiastical principality on their own, that they are untouchable on their own. This is really, really fascinating. We have actually to talk much more about ecclesiastical principalities in Germany, because some of these, like in this case, would be usurped in a way. It's like, I don't know, we've seen like in the Italian communes, the aforementioned bishops, counts were in control, in fact, of the public district, and so the commune is born not by depriving the bishops of this title, but essentially acting namely on his behalf, and so essentially assuming this authority over this public prerogative. So here in Switzerland, it's slightly different, but it's still part of the same broader dynamic. And this is especially the case in a broader feudal sense, or because of the affirmation of rural communes and leagues and so on in Germany, especially in Western Germany in general. Also because after the Interregnum, as we'll see better in some incoming videos, but as notoriously known, the main dynasties of the empire will shift east, right? The same Swabian Habsburgs to Austria, the Luxembourgs from the French part of the empire to Bohemia, etc. So although some of the so-called forest communities, the Waldstätten, namely Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, were Reichsfrei, the Habsburgs, that, as we've seen, tried to walk in the footsteps of the Hohenstaufen after the latter's demise, continued to assert control over certain villages and much of the surrounding land, essentially pushing these communities and coming to obstacle their liberty. Right? The Interregnum had witnessed again the further collapse of public authority, the privatization of the system. Many noblemen have started doing the same, like seizing as much as they could, bringing lots of the previous estates, communities, orders down. So these great princes of the empire that now are basically rebuilding their own power from a provincial basis, only partially salvaging what is left of the German national, say, public authority, are not particularly inclined to tolerate local autonomies, if anything. They have to respect them to a degree, if anything, because it is really a matter of force, right? But they can increasingly reduce, in fact, these communities' power with very specific policies. For example, even before, of course, the demise of the Hohenstaufen, the Habsburgs built the castle of Neue Habsburg in 1244, essentially only 4 years after Schwyz had attained the Reichsfrei status, with the objective of managing the area of Lake Lucerne and limit the influence of the neighboring forest communities that, you understand, are also part of this broader interland. They are, in fact, the rural communes, the peasantry in many ways. So those that, especially in times of crisis, especially this is a moment of great growth in Europe, right? So you have this interesting phenomenon in Germany that is also a country that tends to grow a bit later than the others, but in this sense also creating a bit more complication to the nobility that is also hyper fragmented compared to other areas of Europe. So you have this clashes, right, including between the nobility and these peasants, including in Switzerland. We've seen this for the Dithmarschen from the opposite end of the country, and we will look at other cases of leagues properly that fight against. We've seen it with the Swabian League in the video about medieval Swabia. There was also the Rhineland League, etc. Now, in 1245, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen is excommunicated by Pope IV at the Council of Lyon, notoriously. When the Habsburgs allied themselves with the Pope, which was, of course, like, a matter of personal interest, they had enjoyed the benefits of the alliance with them, but they were not counting or hoping, of course, that Swabian power could simply reinforce once again, or especially affect these lands of theirs. Some of the forest communities understand this, and of course they side instead for Frederick II. At the time, nobody really could know really what would happen in the following decades, because Frederick also died somehow accidentally. Just 5 years later, it's not like the Hohenstaufen finished there. There is still Conrad IV, but he also goes to Italy and dies there. Then there is Conrad in the story, but there Swabia is already basically on its own. So there are, and the Habsburgs keep on capitalizing out of this. So there is already tension arising between the Habsburgs and this embryonal Helvetic power, if we can so say. During this turbulent period, it was extremely violent. The Habsburgs were involved in, gradually ever larger scale policies. So it's not these specific peasants at the Alpine foothills that really caused too much damage overall. The scale, in fact, of the same ambitions increases as the one of this community's autonomy that can't quite be stopped, and it being secondary gradually manages to capitalize from the sort of the centralized position after all. And the castle of Neu-Habsburg, for example, was attacked during this period in retaliation against the Swabian house, sustained damage. Following Frederick's defeat against the Pope, those who had supported him faced threats of excommunication as well, which at least bolstered the power of the Habsburgs. And for the Swiss, like in their Valais, like being excommunicated or not was not this huge deal, but this could be weaponized at least as a legitimate measure, for example, to infringe upon those public prerogatives that had been granted by the empire. In 1273, the rights to the forest communities were in fact sold even by a cadet branch of the Habsburg dynasty to the family patriarch Rudolph I. And this attitude tells you, of course, of how still in charge, like the feudal authority is in this world. Again, there is nothing strictly deterministic or teleological about the rise of this or that people. This is somehow strange, because when you look at sort of European history, you look at the various countries, and like in this case, Switzerland, that is somehow very characteristic and well outlined, historically speaking. But some countries have some different national origin, right? This one is in many ways like, I don't know, even if in a very different one, but let's spare them for the sake of also the memory of their conflict. Austria, essentially emerging out of just feudal reasons, right? There isn't really any deeper, again, specific divide that created this state, as opposed to, because otherwise there would have been so many other states in Europe had we to follow exactly that sort of localism, right? This is different. It's the product of extremely bitter fighting, and even if of a successful formula that could, however, at this point just belong to like a random European peasant revolt in some decentralized areas and during times of crisis of feudalism, all right? And especially the Swiss take a long time before fully evolving to something more recognizably independent through this heraldic forest that the same confederacy turns out to be within the same German one, right? So that basically we get the Alpine Germans here to be outlined, separated from the other. So, you know the story, we actually didn't talk too much about it, but it's one I wrote an entire master thesis on this period of Habsburgic history. Rudolph is crowned King of the Romans with papal support. This title would essentially bring the Habsburgs to that like imperial level that they will not fully consolidate until the mid-15th century, as in, say, in the more grandiose way that we historically know. This is exactly what I was saying about the Swiss, like it transposed at the Habsburgic level. Hadn't they recomposed their various branches, including the one ruling in Switzerland, etc., like we wouldn't even talk about them. We would talk about another German dynasty. In any case, Rudolf was recognized as the ruler, of course, of all the Reichsfrei communities, because now he was king of the Romans, so the would-be Holy Roman Emperor. He would never go to Italy because he thought about that 3 or 4 times, but he had much bigger concerns in Germany because everything had been falling apart and he worked like crazy to put things back together. And so now the provincial issues that the Habsburgs had with the local Swiss, let's call it in this way at this point, were escalating further because now Rudolf was the detainer of those imperial rights himself, right? Besides being, of course, the local lord on the lands of his Habsburg dominion, where these recalcitrant communities existed. He implemented a strict regime in his homeland and significantly increased taxes to fund wars and expand his territories, quite successfully, by the way. As king, he became the direct liege lord of the forest communities, resulting in a curtailment of their previous de facto independence. On April the 16th, 1291, Rudolf purchased all rights to the town of Lucerne. By the way, consider this, that they could simply buy them, right? That would always be the local community, somebody that would be willing to accept the trade. Because again, nobody thought like, you have to make this effort as a 21st century person, understanding what the world was at the time and how communities worked, how national or provincial identities worked. It was like this puzzle of many different communities superimposing on one another with different estates, with different seigneuries. And so there's nothing obvious eventually about, on the same year, like this, the system agglutinating the way it would historically do. Not even at the time was definitive, of course, but it would turn out to be. And so you have the purchase of all rights to the town of Lucerne, the Abbey estates in Unterwalden from Murbach Abbey that is located in Alsace. The forest communities at this point realized that their trade route across the Lake Lucerne is threatened. And so they freak out because they realize that if that line is cut, they will lose their autonomies. And so when Rudolf dies on July the 15th in 1291, in Speyer, by the way, a great symbol of imperial legacy in Germany, the communities began preparing for self-defense. Of course, like the death of the Habsburg was, he even expected that. I mean, he, as a dying man, decided to mount on horseback and reach Speyer from Vienna, and just to have this this grand finale, the great ruler he was. Of course, his death provided with some margin for autonomization, but in, of course, explicit opposition to the Habsburgic house. This is all contextual to the incredibly intricate power struggles that were taking place in Germany at the time, with other houses opposed to the Habsburgs, etc. So, like, again, from the Swiss perspective, this is a very local matter because they want to sell. They can't sort of intervene, they're not a power. They can't intervene in Germany. These are the bigger players that they can at best shelter themselves from. But this is exactly what they do. They just have to brace for impact because they know that sooner or later, the Swabian, the Habsburgs will come back knocking at the door. And so, on August the 1st, 1291, an everlasting league was formed among the forest communities for mutual defense against a common adversary, and everlasting in wood. Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, we do not talk specifically about the history of the Swiss Confederacy, in the sense that we will talk more in depth about all this process in a video dedicated to the politics. But of course, we go on up to the 15th century to explain what happened to, of course, to Switzerland, how it sort of came to be through the same confederacy, and not, because not all of it was that. Now, it began from a restricted pool of communities, just extended, as you know, later, far and wide. Now, in Valais, escalating tensions between the bishops of Sion and the counts of Savoy ignited a war that began in 1260. We made a video about Savoy, not quite about the county per se, but we'll have to talk more about Savoyard power. It was quite aggressive and dynamic. It would come to be reduced in the region at the hands of the same Swiss, but not before all these clashes. Savoy had been another rival of the Habsburgs, by the way, and so it's not also by chance the same areas now are contended by these other powers that the Swiss will find themselves between them. This war came to an end after the Battle of Schwerpunkt near Loic in 1296, in which the Savoyards are defeated by the bishop's army, bolstered by the troops from Bern. These battles are sort of lesser known. We should actually talk about them, getting a bit into the least known battles, not just like the big ones that, the war games books sort of skipped for some weird reason, including, the medieval, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare that crosses out the most important battles of Europe. But these smaller ones, because we also do not know too much about their tactics, etc., but they are little steps to the affirmation of specific powers. In this case, you find, for example, Bern participating in the battle. Again, these were all coalition forces and very complicated, very composite ones, but it's a first important stance. There is a peace settlement in 1301 where Savoy retains only the lower portion of Valais, while the bishop governed the upper part. We're talking about the bishop of Sion, sponsored by the rising Swiss that now are the Confederacy. The opening of the Gotthard Pass, further opening of the Gotthard Pass in the 13th century, as we've seen, had conferred central Switzerland with a much bigger strategic relevance. This is particularly true for the Valley of Uri. The symbols of this. Uri is an auroch, Bern is a bear. You have all this recurring, of course, beautiful heraldry that is exactly what you would have regularly all across Europe at such small cantonal levels, and that eventually is projected into like modern sort of heraldry and better known country symbology because of the success of these small entities, which is rare historically. And so chapeau to the Swiss for that. So as we've seen, the Valley of Uri had been blessed by the Hohenstaufen with this imperial liberty, and the area would become essentially the foundation, right? Probably the basis of the Swiss Confederacy. That during the first half of the 14th century, especially from the 30s to the 50s, as we'll see now, would come to encompass its core of the Acht Orte, that is to say the 8 places, which essentially the 8 cantons. The 14th century is the crucial shift from the feudal order, dominated by provincial families of lesser nobility, towards the emergence of powerful entities, characteristic of the late medieval period. For example, most important lesser nobility of Switzerland were the houses of Bubenberg, Eschenbach, that's the one of Wolfram, Falkenstein, Freiburg, Froburg, Grunenberg, Greifenstein, Homburg. Homburg was technically an Habsburgic branch, like for example, Werner von Homburg was imperial vicar in Lombardy at the time of Henry VII, and he had basically his great grandfather in common with Rudolph of Habsburg. We have seen the dynasty of Kiburg that fights against the Habsburgs initially. You have Landenberg, the Rapperswil, Toggenburg, the Zeringen. We talk about them in the previous generations. And so all these are sort of very typically Swabian minor nobiliary houses that in a way either are exhausted, are extinguished, they do not make it, like they flow into some other group, or they do not make it to any greater role, right? In this region, some succeed. However, most of them will be impacted by the rise of the Swiss Confederacy. The Habsburgs are the only one of the previous Swabian noblemen to reach that level of regional power in Germany. Right? They are actually among at some point, probably the most powerful house in the country. However, in this western territory, Burgundy, Burgundian noblemen and Savoy try to undermine that Habsburgic presence that, as we've said, is also in its center of power very much shifted in the east. This actually favors the rise of the Swiss Confederacy because it's actually stemming from a process of general destructuring of the previous hierarchy, right? When you look at the free imperial cities, at prince, bishoprics, monasteries, some go down, indeed, they're compelled to seek alliances, but the Swiss Confederacy manages to capitalize on this, exactly leading to a series of pacts that will bring for what was technically a Landfried, right? So technically this originally public prerogative of the emperors to call for a general pacification of the land. This is how technically the 1291 Confederacy, like properly Switzerland, is born, right? It was just essentially a tool used in feudal Germany to pacify the land. That the locals say, okay, we need it because we know that a storm is coming and we need to at least ensure ourselves with the local liberty that we own, the autonomy, again, the freemen, the noblemen, that also allowed this to happen, to bond together. We see a great deal of this chivalric nobiliary influence still within the same confederacy in many ways. Again, it's not like knights or noblemen were wiped out. There was an aristocracy, a patriciate in the main Swiss cities that essentially had that kind of lifestyle. This is the 14th century. You have the Codex Manesse, you have the Zurich Armorial, which show you what kind of men actually held power in the later Middle Ages, in these areas that are, again, praised for their spirit of independence, but they weren't really letting the peasantry be in charge. That's not exactly how it worked. The same peasant communities had an elite, had an aristocracy of sort. Now, more or less, of course, but as we were saying before, it's the bigger, wealthier city elites that really control the Confederacy at some point, like the brutal, primitive mountaineers that will form the bulk also of the pretty aggressive and resilient Swiss armies are something else. They have less power. So it's interesting to look at the broader map as well, because the Swiss Confederacy is born between the Habsburgs that dominate essentially southeastern Germany, plus the strain of territories up to the border with the French, with Burgundy, the latter, and Savoy, also Milan in the south, because the Milanese are rising. The Ticino, the Tellina Valley, they have like this protrusion towards the north with Como, with Bergamo again, and some of course, also the Italian parts of, some properly parts of Lombardy will be integrated within the Swiss Confederacy. So there is an Italian part, of course, together with the German. There is a majority, and the French one. And speaking of minor engagements that would have a great relevance, at least in the beginning of the major clashes that we can document between the Habsburgs and the Confederacy, actually before the birth of the same, that partially shows you why in perspective also the same was created. You have Schosshalde in 1289, already same year the Battle of Campaldino that we often discuss. Imagine that. You have Rudolph of Habsburg against Bern in an actually successful enterprise, because essentially the Habsburg here, like the single clashes are well documented by Swiss historiography. We can get into them if you want, but today we just have so much time. But basically, Rudolph besieges Bern, and he literally causes a feigned flight that in turn triggers the sortie of the Bernese that are countercharged by the Habsburgs and annihilated. We're talking about losses of, between 100 and 150 men. But for Bern, that was not like an immense center. Like, it was still relevant, and this proving still the superiority, especially of the Habsburgic feudal cavalry that, as you know, will also suffer atrociously from the later clashes with the Swiss. But this is a first interesting clash, showing that, again, remember that here we are before Courtrai, right? So there have been battles, especially in Lombardy, that have showed there were many Swiss there. At least this is what Swiss historiography stresses to a degree, that some of these people had learned how to fight against cavalry in Italy. That, well, it was a hell of a war school, and objectively they were that close, to Lombardy in particular. So it's actually pretty. We're not talking just about peasants, but of course noblemen as well. For example, we mentioned before Berner from Homburg and others, but the same brother of Rudolph, Hermann, had died in Lombardy in the army of Frederick II against the Lombards. So it's a quite interestingly dense period in military history as well. And I was making a point, but I forgot. Yes, the sense that the Swiss did not really have to rise in a deterministic sense, also because at the time nobody really thought that heavy cavalry, especially in Germany, to be honest, could simply be defeated, right? And it's only over time that this confidence is gained. And the Swiss are also a bit like the ones that entered this more gradually, because I need to make this brief digression, but if you have followed my videos about infantry war, medieval infantry warfare, you know the story. The infantry victories of the early 14th century are very extemporaneous. I mean, they're really impressive, but they stop with the mid-14th century crisis, and you need literally the Swiss of the mid-15th century to restart beating cavalry with infantry only, right? And and this is the important thing to remember, that the Swiss army of the mid-15th century has literally nothing to do with the one of the first half of the 14th, right? It was sort of a completely different tactical concept, and just also a very different Switzerland. And so you can argue that even the battles that which the Swiss triumph in this first half of the 14th century are hotly contested. Sometimes they are ambushes, like they're not typical, I don't know, like I can't even think of a typical like open field clash. I mean, even at Courtrai, the Flemish are behind a ditch, the canal of some sort. So it's not like in the 15th century the Swiss literally take the open field and steamroll cavalry, right? Also because they take it by surprise. It's not because they would have simply met it frontally in open field. We should stress that as well. But they are more like we're trying to resist here. It's more a defensive mentality, and it's made by people who do not have a great deal of collective training. They know the terrain very well. They know how to exploit it, but still they have to grow, right? They don't have a prevalence of pikes. And so there's the Vosges in Switzerland that is a bit like, the weapon of the Swiss, like the Flemish have the Gödendag or the Gefindestabe, or I don't know, there are different weapons here and there that are not even technically the reason why these peoples win or not. In fact, they were somehow standard pole axes in most of the cases. But just for saying again, and I say this because it makes the rise of the Swiss ever more exceptional. Like if you attribute them, who knows which alchemic formula for which they rose that others hadn't come, you miss the entire point, not just of Swiss history, but of the entire art of war. It was pure moral force that was driving them, right? They were incredibly primitive people in many ways. They literally had nothing, right? Switzerland was one of the poorest places in the empire. They didn't even have like armor to the extent other peoples would have. They had to despoil the enemies at large to have adequate protection. They didn't have guns early in times. They had to steal it from the Burgundians after they defeated them. Like it's rough. Of course, the elite had panoplies, etc. But again, it's also a more communal movement, we can say. There are knights, etc. But mostly they will serve with these infantry forces that come from this more rustic and backward background, in fact. And so there is all a military history that is very interesting to look at in detail, but the highlights are, for example, the Battle of Laupen in 1339, and this is essentially a massive coalition forces from both sides. There are Swiss fighting also for the Habsburgs in this battle, together with Savoy, for example. You do have other cantons. The defenders at Laupen that win the day are headed at least by Basel, right? And there are other cantons from their side. And the Battle of Laupen is interesting because it's really a Moscow to Moscow, not even technically an open field. The Swiss, let's say by approximation here to make it simpler, had the high ground, and the enemy doesn't manage to break through, right? And it's also, a cavalry clash, and it's very interesting because there are some protagonists of this battle that you find also in Italy, in Flanders, during some interesting times of infantry warfare. And so again, the Swiss connection between these lands is quite frankly fascinating. Also considering that, again, we don't have many evidence of what the Swiss thought or said at this point or regarding these topics. in detail. You can't quite reconstruct in this. Many of these battles are also famous because of the mythology of the Swiss. But consider that they are they are along the road that connects Flanders with Italy at this point. They have Savoy next. They're connected with the Habsburg. So they actually know a lot of what is going on all around, which is also replete with hell of military schools, as we pointed out. But Laupen is definitely a first affirmation of really Swiss force in more or less an open context. It is really fascinating. In all this, the situation is very fragmented. Like, you don't have a single front. You have the initial core of the Confederacy that is there, but there are so many different other groups involved in the country that are supporting the Habsburgs, who are, for example, seeking to exert their influence over the cities of Lucerne and Zurich themselves, because obviously these were, again, the most important centers. Who cares about the mountaineers? They may have some power, but if you behead these richer cities, you really control the entire system, because also the mountaineers depend on the local markets down the valleys, and there's more international centers, and so that was the obvious thing to do. The rest is fringe, right? And that's the point of Switzerland, again, that they managed to connect these two sides, right? And they combined them effectively, modernity and tradition, in these different parts of the country. Of course, this caused unrest. There are attempted coups between 1343 and 1350. So there are internal factions in the cities that are against or pro-Habsburg. There are turmoils prompting the cities of Lucerne, of Zurich, and Bern to make this very important step to align with the Swiss Confederacy, each respectively in 1332, 1351, and 1353, which essentially matches also with the mid-14th century crisis. As you understand here, like, the Habsburgs are pretty big, especially early in the century, in spite of the rise of the Luxembourg, etc. But in the mid-14th, like, you have a much greater difficulty in waging war from the two opposite ends of Germany, and everything tends to shrink a bit, and the local communities to actually reinforce themselves on their feet. So gradually, these major cities realize that the Habsburgs are more distant politically, against their will, definitely, but still so, and so they decide to join forces with the Confederacy, which actually allows them also to become sort of the most influential centers within the same. So like many other parts of Europe, Switzerland did face itself the crisis of the 14th century, primarily due to the Black Death. This crisis was accompanied by social upheaval and moral panics that often targeted the Jewish community, as exemplified by the tragic Basel massacre of 1349. Additionally, there is a catastrophic earthquake in the same Basel in 1356, which devastates like a large area, and on top of this, there is the near total destruction of the city when it was consumed by fire. This tells you how also, brutally heavy, like the blows that could come at you and the spirit could be. Also considering that you're not just competing with external powers, but also the ones internal to the Confederacy that often is divided. Like, they do not have like an absolute agreement on everything. They're just trying to remain independent, which is, however, still a big deal. From the 50s to the 80s of the 14th century, the balance of power still remained relatively stable, by the way, as the Habsburgs continued, in spite of their own difficulties, to regain their former influence in Switzerland. Albert II, for example, unsuccessfully besieges Zurich, but also manages to impose an unfavorable peace on the city through the Treaty of Regensburg. Indeed, other powers around understood that the Confederacy had been born, had been developing, and wanted to break it, but still there was enough room for managing relations with this or that city, just like it would occur, in other parts of Germany, by the way. In 1375, the Habsburgs aimed to reclaim control over the Aargau area with the help of Gugler mercenaries. What are these Gugler mercenaries? They are essentially English and French knights, led by Enguerrand VII de Coucy, that invade Alsace and the Swiss plateau during the war, in fact, of St. 1375. Just the other day, we talked about the Italian condottieri and the White Company of John Hawkwood that arrived in the peninsula after the Treaty of Bretigny. This is exactly the same dynamic. This is sort of the height of period, aside from the Brabançon in the 12th century, but especially at this point during the truces of the 100 Years' War. In fact, of the, say, soldiers of fortune, let's call it this way, free companies, that of course find in this land repleted with torment and plenty of turbulence, lots of opportunities to fight. There are some smaller clashes that sometimes are even difficult to simply explain. For example, the one at Sörenberg that is essentially fought over the control of the local mountain pastures by two different cantons, but there are of course the Habsburgs behind, and so we also don't know even too much about these Swiss mountaineers beating the hell out of each other, but they were again pretty roughly brutal contests. You have the Battle of Nathan, and that is also quite interesting because it witnesses an initial victory of the Habsburgic forces. I say Habsburgic, but it's always also local forces, because the Swiss defenders placed themselves behind some fortifications that they used to create some sort of walls to protect their pastures in the highlands. That gets broken, right, by the Habsburgs that attack and manage essentially to break the resistance. However, while the winners are plundering the down Valais, the Swiss reform and come back and crush the enemies. The smaller clashes, we will see them more in depth in some other video, but they're interesting. The largest battle, however, is Sempach in 1386. Sempach is interesting because you have somehow a typical men-at-arms dismounting tactics. It wasn't just an English thing, especially during the post-14th century period, which the Habsburgic knights try to break the Swiss formation, and they fail. There are other clashes. We will talk about ambushes as well. The Swiss are good at, of course, attracting the enemy cavalry on narrow passes, like tough terrains of sort, and blocking them with tree logs, like stones thrown from the heights, and similar things that you're aware of. This actually doesn't show us a particularly advanced military culture. In fact, by this point, the Swiss, I stress that these battles are not just relatively exceptional in the same period, because after the mid-14th century, you don't find much infantry victories. And in fact, these aren't really pure infantry victories, right? They are, in some cases, like you can, of course, equate them also to the ones of the first half, where the same Swiss had won them. And so you find actually a Swiss continuity in this up to the mid-15th century, but what happens then, it is really bearded, right? And the Swiss keep being beaten on different occasions by men-at-arms. I mean, the same reason why they decide at some point to use the pike squares to abandon the prevalence of the halberd is exactly because, say, Carmagnola's men-at-arms, like of the army of Milan, had dismounted and beaten them at Arbed in 1422, and that's literally the moment in which they sit down at a table and say, okay, we have to fix this because the art of war doesn't wait for us. In fact, actually, if you look at what happened with the Swiss, also in the Italian wars at the beginning of the 16th century, they're overrun eventually by more complex systems using combined arms, which they do not have simply the means to use because they do not really have large artillery forces or cavalry or shot, etc. They just have pikemen at that point. Just pretty, also individually not extremely performing individuals, especially in pike square warfare. Like in this earlier part, at least you find these rustics that really go for it, like individually. Those later tactics are a bit different, and they're not, say, as tough even as before, because you increase the collective training, so you actually cause major bloodsheds, but it's not like the individual is stronger than before, on the contrary. So after the defeat at Sempach, the Habsburgs really feel beaten down. They redirect their ambitions eastward, because of course they had like a much broader regional reality to contend also for quite bigger powers. So they let essentially the Swiss go in many ways. This is naturally painful for them because the Habsburgs lose in the process, and not without a fight, but still without sort of their main effort concentrated there, some of their ancestral lands. For example, the Swiss annexed the Aargau in 1416. So you have this moment of Swiss expansion where the Confederacy emerges as a coherent political entity, controlling a contiguous territory also for the first time. There's really a Swiss interland and political unity and territorial control, which is really remarkable. It starts becoming a relevant power in the international scene as well. In Basel, the populace was still, however, divided into pro-Habsburg and anti-Habsburg factions. Right? The fact that the Swiss would be essentially the first out of the Holy Roman Empire in a practical political sense, because the Dutch are the first one to secede in greater pomp later on, does not mean, in fact, that the Swiss do not feel the fact that they're German and that they are part of a German kingdom, and that there are rules there, just like in bowling, not in Vietnam. And the sense is, in fact, that there is still an option for the Habsburgs to play on all and whatever rules, like in surroundings on the various groups, right? For example, in Basel, you have the Sterne and the Psitticher that are respectively the pro and the anti-Habsburg factions, right? In 1392, and the citizens of Greater Basel bought most of their privileges from the bishop. As a result, although Basel nominally remained under the control of the prince-bishops until the Reformation, it was effectively governed by its city council. This is really similar, again, to the early, Italian communes, as we were saying before, with the bishops' counts. It's not like that you disregard episcopal authority. Because, again, I think it happens too often. I have followers that ask me wherever they see the communes, wherever, say, but where were there anarchists? Like, were this anti-tradition? No, this has absolutely nothing to do with that. They even they recognize really even the same imperial authority. As far as, of course, this was advantageous to them. In general, it was, because there was, again, a set of rules by which they could play that would enshrine part of their liberties, as they had been, as we've seen, like properly provided by the same emperors back in the day. So it wasn't an anti-system behavior. It was rather like the creation of another one within a power vacuum for their own contingent interests, right? The Basel City Council is the mirror, let's say, of the local guilds since 1382. Again, these are not really city-states, we often make this distinction. They're essentially towns, and not even among the most powerful, like around, like in Germany, there are many more. And that's not even, of course, like the most urbanized and economically thriving part of the continent. However, they grow in importance. They attract more investments, and this attitude, like of asserting their own communal identity within the same confederacy, spreads further. For example, only 5 years later, in 1387, the Bishop of Geneva grants the citizens of its city substantial political rights. And so it's the same way. These communes emerge as part of an autonomization, an emancipation from the same episcopal authority that, however, remains always there. It just has to surrender these prerogatives because there is nobody else that can prevent that, right? And this happened, of course, like in other places where some counts had subjugated bishops, and or like the bishops had gently, faded away in terms of secular power because, there were other people. Like in Cologne, the largest city in Germany, the bishop was expelled from the city and had to negotiate like all the entrance and everything, except he had a massive princely estate all around the city, all along the Rhine. So you have this interesting dynamics that are known across Germany. Switzerland is not really, as a league, much of an exception. In fact, other parts of Switzerland, especially in the west, remained under the control of Burgundy and Savoy throughout the 14th century because, again, this was normal. There were other lords that were powerful enough to maintain their capacity. At some point, they will crush against the Swiss, but because, again, they were equally competitive powers. The barony of Vaud was incorporated into Savoy in 1359, and the Béarnais would be able to get it back for the Confederacy in 1536 during the Swiss Reformation. In Valais, the Bishop of Sion allied with Amadeus VI, the Count of Savoy, that we have seen the other day in the video about the condottieri, because it was the same guy who was defeated by John Oakwood, had been called by John II Palaiologus to defend Montferrat, right? And he's the Green Count in this legion of the Savoyard house that embroils himself in a war over the Upper Valais that was also an area settled by the Valais communities. We are in the 40s of the 14th century. I made a video about the Valais as well. It was together with Alberstadt and even the Reconquista. If you search them in the title, you will find them. About like this kind of communal expansion, right, of essentially farmlands, pastures, mostly in this case, and it's quite interesting, especially for the Valais, that we will have to look at more in depth. And so what happens in the 40s, the Green Count pacifies this area. He conquers it, like, and manages sort of to subjugate it in 1352 as a whole, but the year after there is yet another insurrection. And this is really tough to contain because, again, nobody really took these peasants so seriously, especially so early in time. These are the phases in which, yes, they are uniting, but they're just, again, rural communes like others. You don't really, like, you come from one of the noblest houses in Europe. You exude feudalism and militarism from every pore. You're one of, again, you're into English, French politics. There is the 100 Years' War in between. These guys do not look scary at all. But at the same time, they're very stubborn, and they spring back, right? And they try to regain what is theirs. And they're not really easy to convince. This is what happens normally in the fringe, right? Naturally, Savoy controlled much more prosperous areas full of castles, of markets, of palaces, and so on. This area is not like that, but it's still strategically relevant, considering, especially at this point in the general crisis of the era, greater powers are shrinking, and so these more astute ones can seize what nobody can basically dislodge them from. And that's why such local feuds are increased, because it's done first of all like by outstretching your own same resources, and from the other side it's a matter also of political survival. By 1355, the towns of Upper Valais thus form a defensive pact and negotiate a compromise peace from this condition of force with Savoy in 1361. And this peace, in fact, lasts until a renewed uprising following the accession of Amadeus VII, the Count of Savoy, in 1383 occurs, right? Because Amadeus invades Valais 4 years later, yet he dies of an accident. Normally this nobleman would break their necks often like hunting, right? So also with just a broken bone that could infect, etc. So Amadeus' mother, Bonne de Bourbon, I made a video about the House of Bourbon during the Middle Ages, negotiates peace with the 7 tithings of Upper Valais, which restores the status quo from 1301. And this only because of an accident, right? Because otherwise the guy would have probably kept fighting there. Here, of course, Savoy has also different branches within the same house that fight against one another. So this death really ruins a bit the policy for them. And so this is, however, how from there on Upper Valais effectively becomes independent, paving the way for the sort of communal system like that would emerge later in the early modern era. This is also the time in which the Grisons, that is to say, a canton with Cour as its capital, so we're in probably the Alpine hinterland, begins to develop a similar local self-governing system, including the founding of the League of God's House in 1367, followed by the Grey League in 1395. And the name Grey League comes from the homespun grey clothing worn by its members, hence the Grisons. And this league would eventually become part of the canton of Graubünden for the same etymological reason. Both leagues emerged in response to the expanding influence of the House of Habsburg that was, again, still around here. If you make a cross-section of the chronology, you realize that this was before Sempach, and so that everything was still in theory, and so we're really at the beginning of the Swiss confederal history. So talking about medieval Switzerland crossing the later confederal state out for a more in-depth video brings us to stop here. But you understand how remarkable Switzerland is in this regard, but at the same time how it emerges from a situation that is typical of Germany, that is typical of this hyper-fragmentation of like a land that is not particularly developed, but it's also not so primitively underdeveloped, like, I don't know, like northern Germany, where you have the Dithmarschen that, yes, managed to actually establish some sort of communal independence, but are eventually crushed by historically by the nobility that at some point had always also controlled them. At least, you know, a bit like the Swiss we've seen at the beginning of the period. Instead, of course, the Swiss Confederacy evolves into something else. And this, of course, has different explanations, including, in fact, like the greater context. It's closer to civilization to begin with, and so there is a greater involvement also in this international scene. I mean, you have, again, France from one side, Savoy from the other, the Habsburgs, Milan. You are, in a way or another, becoming important. And that's how it's eventually the case during the Renaissance, the Italian Wars, in which they basically even captured Milan by themselves. And And so it's something that simply, like 200 years before, you could have not seen coming, unless you account like this unpredictable set of circumstances that allowed the Swiss just to triumph. Like, what if, I don't know, the Burgundians managed to defeat the Swiss in just one of those battles that brought to the end of Burgundy instead, right? So it's really a unique, incredible history that speaks of of course, like some advantages in decentralization and compared to the main powers in Europe. Like, there is some general, like, nobody really wants to control, like, it's not like nobody wants Switzerland, even because we just described how everybody was trying to maintain a control on that, but it's not like people are interested, especially in the Alpine hinterland, per se, right? There are much richer places, and that's why also Switzerland, at the end of the day, that's also not to have been given for granted, but remains isolated, remains out of the games, right? The main turn was Marignano. If they had not been crushed at Marignano, likely they would have retained Milan, but this would have also probably brought to the end of Switzerland as we know it. Instead, they were lucky, paradoxically, to be defeated, so that Switzerland entrenched itself within itself. And again, not even at the time it was a particularly relevant power, nor like it is today, but of course manages to acquire this shocking amount of wealth for which, like, all the world envies them, and this all comes from this incredible and relentless struggle for survival that this man started, you can argue, since the time they had to flee, the Merovingian Franks, taking refuge in the Alps under Theodoric, and that again fought against nature in this impervious highlands, against the elements, and then winning their autonomy against the Habsburgs and their ferocious feudal knights, etc., etc. And so it's really like, it's beautiful even to think that these fantastic places, like if you have ever been to Switzerland in general, like as a tourist or more, are like, it's not a vast amount. Like, most of it is mountains, in fact, and so also it's uninhabited, but it's exactly the same places, right, that had this happening, right? And not just you have the incredible success of this country in the contemporary era, but you have the impression that sort of history, while other countries change, like the idea is when you visit the Alps, other mountainous areas, is that like the lowlands change, because there are the places where there are more people, where there is more wealth, where there is, at least, except for Switzerland, like in this case, you have to consider that there's no other, say, Alpine or mountain state that is really hyper rich in the world, which is interesting. But really, you have history changing faster there. When you visit these places, it feels like time stopped, except you have also this enormous privilege of having so much money and such a great, for example, military ethics, in spite of being a neutral country, for which, like, the Swiss are full of guns everywhere, and yet they have an incredibly disciplined use of the same, with practically no mass killings of sort, and so it's a great example in history that has, and I hope that this is especially considering the beginnings of that, and seeing like the Confederal experiment as a sort of exception in this sense, like, has a very deep European, pan-European meaning and root, right? That much of that time stopping in Switzerland is also connected to, in fact, a medieval mentality that still lives within these people that are so proud indeed about their origin in 1291, politically wise, but that evidently stemmed from a previous background that could have been common to the other Swabians, for example, but it instead took that specific civic stand that thus allowed exactly this incredible history to happen. And so I think it's really beautiful to think it in these terms, and we have to talk more about Swiss history because it is that educational, it is that entertaining, and it deserves being told. Now for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.